I did not wake to alarms or sirens or the crack of gunfire. There was no invasion, no sky aflame, no proclamation carved into the clouds. The end of my world, at least the beginning of its end, arrived quietly, folded into routine, disguised as a clerical smudge. I noticed it because noticing was my duty. I was raised to notice margins, to respect columns, to believe that order itself was a form of prayer. I worked in a mid-tier administratum hab block, a place where the air was always dry with recycled incense and paper dust. The walls sweated faintly with condensation from pipes older than recorded maintenance cycles. Every surface bore the marks of fingers long dead, smudges of oil, wax, skin. We catalogued cargo arrivals, tithe receipts, devotional allotments. Nothing glorious, nothing heroic, but necessary, always necessary. The Imperium survives on necessity. That morning, I was cross-referencing a shipment of ration bars and promethium filters when I saw the stamp UNKNO do URIGN. The ink was fresh, still slightly raised, as if proud of itself. I frowned because origin fields were never blank. Even cursed worlds had designations. Even quarantined rocks had numbers. I checked the accompanying prayer roll, the thin parchment that traveled with every shipment so the goods could be blessed in transit. Where our world's name should have been, where I had written it 1,000 times before, there was only an empty line. At first, I assumed fatigue. The lumen strips flickered often, and eyes lie when they are overworked. I blinked, adjusted the cogitator's angle, ran my finger along the line. The paper was unbroken. No erasure marks, no scorch, just absence. A silence where a word had always lived. I glanced around the office. Rows of clerks hunched over their desks like penitents, quills scratching in a rhythmic devotion. No one spoke above a whisper. We were trained out of that early. But something had changed. I could hear the quills more clearly than usual, the way they dug into parchment, pressing hard, as if force might anchor reality. A servitor shuffled past with a tray of stamped forms, its augmetic arm clicking softly, its face smooth and devotional in its emptiness. I remember thinking, irrationally, that it looked relieved. I did what procedure demanded. I logged the discrepancy. Form 44 copper, subsection, cartographic or nomenclatural inconsistency. 3 copies, 1 for local records, 1 for sector archive, 1 for devotional review. I filled in the fields carefully, my handwriting neat, respectful. World of origin, I hesitated. The quill hovered, my mind snagged on the name, not forgotten, but suddenly fragile, like a word spoken too loudly in a chapel. I wrote it anyway. I remember the relief of seeing the letters form, solid and obedient. I attached the forms to the manifest and submitted them to the review chute. The chute swallowed paper with a wet, sucking sound, like something feeding. Minutes later, too quickly, the forms returned, stamped Wresselvidian green ink, no notes, no corrections. Just a small cog and skull sigil pressed into the corner, signifying machine adjudication. I felt a chill then, despite the heat. The air tasted wrong. That is the only way I can describe it. Like scorched paper and recited lies. Like incense burned without faith behind it. I told myself it was stress. We are encouraged to tell ourselves that. Stress is a manageable sin. Throughout the day, the pattern repeated. Cargo from our docks labeled with vacant origins. Census tallies that skipped directly from one neighboring system to another, as if we were a mathematical inconvenience. Even the devotional announcements, printed every hour and posted on the hab walls, had changed. The daily prayer for planetary perseverance had been replaced with a more general benediction, one that thanked the Emperor for the correction of error and the removal of burden. At mid-shift, I approached Senior Clerk Halrix. He had trained me when my hair was darker and my hands less steady. I pointed out the discrepancies, spoke in the approved tones of concern without accusation. He did not look at the papers. He did not look at me. His eyes were fixed on a point just above my shoulder, as if reading something I could not see. Errors resolve themselves, he said softly. Do not obstruct resolution. That was all, a reprimand disguised as wisdom. By the time the shift ended, the hab block felt altered. Not physically, though later I would swear the corridors had grown longer, but in texture. Sound carried differently. Conversations died quicker. People avoided certain words without seeming to know why. I passed a devotional alcove where a woman stood frozen before a votive slate, her lips moving soundlessly. When I followed her gaze, I saw the slate displayed a star map. A familiar cluster of lights gleamed and then did not. One space was dark, not destroyed, simply unlit. I returned to my quarters with the ache of a minor heresy pressing behind my eyes. I recited the litany of trust before eating. Though my ration paste tasted of ash, I recited it again before sleep, though the words felt thinner each time. As I lay on my cot, I tried to picture the curve of our horizon, the particular hue of our sky at dusk. The image came, but it wavered, like ink diluted with too much water. That night, the cogitators hummed louder than usual. Somewhere in the hab block, a printer ran continuously, page after page feeding into a grinder. I dreamed of ledgers without covers, their pages flapping like wounded birds, names lifting off them and drifting away. In the morning, the discrepancy notices were gone from my desk. In their place was a new stack of manifests, pristine and unquestioned. I stood there longer than necessary, fingers resting on the edge of the table, breathing in dust and incense, and the faint metallic tang of fear. I told myself it was a clerical error. That is what we are trained to believe. The reply arrived 3 days after the ink began to misbehave, and it arrived the way so many Imperial judgments do, without a face, without a voice, without the courtesy of explanation. It was waiting on my desk when I clocked in, a single envelope of stiff, grey fibre, sealed with red wax that had cooled into a perfect circle. There was no sender mark, no department stamp, only the seal itself, pressed so deeply into the wax that the skull looked bruised. In our hab block, correspondence was a ritual. You received it standing, you opened it with a sanctioned blade, you read it without visible reaction. That is the expectation. Emotion is waste, and waste is theft from the Emperor. I kept my hands steady. I broke the seal. The wax cracked with a dry, satisfying sound, like a bone set properly. Inside was a single sheet, thick and too clean, as though it had never touched human hands. The letters were not inked but embossed, raised from the page in a cold metallic sheen. I read them twice before they made sense. Nati ofnomen courel cora con subjator again. Risis teos beigt origi erba ediendia peridiardiudi iv remembs campienia selvinar. No signature, no seal beyond the red wax I had already broken. No explanation beyond the implication that explanation was unnecessary. Our world, my world, had not been renamed. It had been vacated. A designation that was not a title but a hole punched in the archive, a null entry, an administrative bruise. I felt something inside my chest tighten, as if I had swallowed a strip of cold metal. I read the line again, prior references are to be ceased, and my tongue tingled with phantom syllables. The name I had written on Form 44, Kappa, suddenly felt like contraband, like a knife concealed in a sleeve. Across the office, quills continued to scratch, cogitators continued to hum. Senior Clerk Helrix did not look up. It struck me then how the Imperium teaches obedience not only through force, but through the calm continuity of everything around you. The machine does not pause for your grief. It keeps running, and you either keep up or you become part of what it grinds. Attached to the notice was a secondary slip, thin, like a ration coupon, ordering me to attend mandatory re-education sermons at the end of my shift. Reconciliation of memory and record, it read, with time and location assigned. Attendance required. Non-attendance reportable. I wanted to crumple it. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to do anything that would prove I was still a person rather than a line item. Instead, I placed the papers in the approved tray and resumed work, because defiance in the Imperium is often nothing more than a brief gesture before the inevitable correction. By mid-day, the hab block had transformed from anxious to obediently terrified. Loudhailers in the corridors repeated new civic instructions in a soft, reassuring tone, as if speaking to children at bedtime. Citizens, the voice said, be advised all references to unverified origins are prohibited pending archival reconciliation. Trust in the Emperor's order. Doubt is the seed of disorder. Doubt. As if my fear were a moral failing rather than a natural response to being erased. The transit tunnels told the story more plainly than any loud hailer. The tunnels were arteries of the hive, long, damp corridors lined with flickering screens and devotional icons, where workers shuffled shoulder to shoulder under the gaze of cherubim cameras. I took them home that evening with the notice tucked inside my coat, like a hidden infection. The screens along the tunnel walls were usually filled with tithe quotas, devotional schedules, and star charts for the benefit of those who needed to imagine a wider galaxy while living inside a metal box. They flickered that night, their images stuttering as if the machines hesitated to show the truth. Then the star chart stabilized, crisp and bright, the familiar constellations rendered in sanctioned lines, and there it was, the gap, a neat, clean absence where our orbit had once been. Not scorched, not marked with warning sigils, not crossed out in furious ink, just missing. A space where the map continued as if nothing had ever occupied it. The heavens had been edited, people saw it. You could tell by the way their eyes clung to the screen for a fraction too long, but no one spoke. In the hive, silence is a skill. Silence is how you survive when the walls have ears and the ears have quills. I returned to my hab corridor and found neighbors clustered around the water ration station, their faces drawn and pale under the sickly lumen glow. Old Mara, who used to tell stories about her childhood in the mid-spires of our world, stood with her cup half filled, staring at it as if it might whisper the name she could not say. I remember the smell, she murmured, too quiet for the warden's microphones if she was lucky. The street markets, spices, oil smoke. The rain, she stopped, brow furrowing. Her mouth worked as if chewing a word that would not form. Her eyes darted left and right, as though the missing syllable might be hiding behind someone's shoulder. What was it called? She asked, voice cracking. The boulevard by the shrine steps, you know, the one with the... Her hands trembled. The cup sloshed water onto the floor. The water vanished into the grime without leaving a trace. A man beside her, Joran, a cargo hand with palms like scar tissue, shook his head as if rejecting a bad thought. Don't, he said. His voice was harsh, not with anger but with fear. Don't chase it, that's what they want. They want you to stumble so they can mark you. Who? Mara whispered. Joran's eyes flicked upward, toward the corner where a cherub camera hovered, its little wings twitching softly as it adjusted focus. The ones with the forms, he said instead. The ones who decide what was real. Later, in my own small room, I tried to test myself the way a nervous clerk tests an unreliable cogitator. I spoke our world's name aloud into the stale air. The syllables came, but wrong. Not quite wrong, but softened as if my own mouth had forgotten the proper shape. My teeth felt unfamiliar against the word. I tried again. The second time my throat tightened, and the sound came out strangled, like a confession cut short. I pressed my palms to my face. I could smell the day's ink on my fingers, the metallic tang of stamped paper, the faint ozone of overworked machines. Beneath it all was something else, newly present, a scent like burned parchment, like a book tossed into a furnace while still open. The re-education sermon was held in a repurposed storage hall. They had cleared away old crates of devotional pamphlets and erected a temporary pulpit draped in stained cloth. Candles burned in rows, their smoke mixing with the industrial stench of damp concrete and old sweat. A mural of the emperor's stern visage, generic, timeless, unavoidable, had been hung across one wall, its eyes following us as we filed in. A preacher stood at the pulpit in a simple robe, but the robe was too clean, the fabric too new. His voice was calm, measured, bureaucratic in its mercy. Citizens, he said, you have been selected for the blessing of clarification. Some of you have experienced confusion. This is not your fault. Confusion is a symptom of outdated records, and outdated records are a wound in the body of the Imperium. We were handed hymn sheets. I recognized the melody immediately, an old devotional tune used for planetary gratitude. But the words had been revised overnight. Where our world's name should have been, there was a blank space, a pause marked by a small printed symbol. We sang anyway. The sound of 100 voices, hitting that printed silence at once, was the most unnerving thing I have ever heard. It was like stepping into a hole you didn't know was there. The melody continued, obedient and intact, but for a heartbeat we were all voiceless, all swallowing absence together. The preacher smiled as if pleased. You see, he said, the Emperor provides. Even when details are corrected, devotion remains. The Imperium does not require your uncertainty, only your compliance. A servitor in the back of the hall recorded attendance, its head swiveling with mechanical patience. A Hab warden watched from the doorway, hand resting on a shock baton like a comforting rosary. When the sermon ended, we were dismissed in orderly rows. Outside, the corridor seemed narrower, or perhaps I was broader with dread. On my way back, I passed a child tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he asked, "where did you grow up?" The mother's face went blank, not confused, blank. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she had been asked to recite a forbidden prayer. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Then, softly, she said, "Hair." The child frowned. "But where is hair?" The mother tightened her grip on his hand until his knuckles whitened. "Hair is where the Emperor says we are," she whispered. "Don't ask again." That night, I lay awake listening to the hive breathe, pipes clanking, distant machinery cycling, faint chanting from someone who could not sleep without prayer. I tried to summon my world in my mind, the curve of its horizon, the shape of its oceans, the smell of its rain. The images came like poorly developed pics, blurred at the edges, washed out, as if someone had rubbed a thumb across the memory and smeared it into anonymity. I clung to small details, the taste of street food, the texture of sun-warmed stone, because the larger picture was beginning to dissolve. The panic, when it arrived, was not loud. It did not scream. It did not throw me from the bed. It sat on my chest like a weight, tamped down, steady and suffocating, like rot beneath a painted floor. By morning, I understood the cruelest part. They had not only erased our world from records. They had begun erasing it from us. They came during second shift, when the Hab block was most vulnerable, when workers were dulled by routine and hunger, when vigilance slipped just enough to be corrected. There was no alarm, no announcement. The first sign was the sudden, unnatural quiet of the corridor outside the office, as if the hive itself had drawn in a breath and decided not to release it. I looked up from my desk and saw them through the glass partition. 3 figures in identical grey coats, fabric matte and light, drinking, the cut severe and without ornament. Their boots made no sound on the metal flooring. Each carried a cogitator slate hugged close to the chest, not like a tool, but like a relic. They smelled of antiseptic and cold ink, a scent that overrode the incense and oil stench we had grown accustomed to. The smell of correction. Senior Clerk Halrick stood at attention before they even spoke. That was when I knew this was no routine inspection. His hands trembled, just slightly, as he offered the sign of the Aquila. The inspectors returned it with perfect symmetry, their movements mirrored, rehearsed, drained of individuality. "We are here to conduct an audit of the living," the one in the center said. The voice was gentle, almost kind, filtered through a vox, grill-tuned to remove warmth. "This will not take long if cooperation is forthcoming." Audit of the living. I had seen the phrase once before, buried in an appendix of a procedural manual, heavily footnoted and rarely invoked. It was used when populations became ambiguous, when existence itself required verification. They began with the nearest desk. Questions were asked quietly, politely, as if discussing inventory discrepancies. State your name. State your place of origin. Describe your earliest memory of civic instruction. The clerk answered too quickly, relief flooding their voice at having something they still knew. The inspector nodded, tapped the slate once, and placed a small adhesive seal on the desk, yellow not red. Follow-up required. The next clerk hesitated on the second question. Just a pause. A heartbeat too long. The inspector did not frown, did not raise their voice. They simply applied a blue seal instead of yellow. Instability. The slate murmured softly. That was how it went. Speed and certainty were liabilities. Hesitation was guilt. Memory itself had become a trap with no safe footing. When they reached me, my mouth had gone dry. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, each beat a reminder that I was still, inconveniently, alive. State your name. The inspector said. I did. State your place of origin. The words rose in my throat and stopped there, a crowd pressing against a closed gate. I felt sweat bead along my spine beneath my work tunic. I thought of the hymn sheet, the printed silence. I chose my answer carefully. I am a citizen of record, I said. Assigned habitation per administratum decree. The inspector tilted their head slightly. Not in confusion, in interest. They said gently, I reside where I am told to reside. I said, I serve where I am assigned to serve. A pause. The inspector's fingers danced across the slate, movements precise, economical. I waited for the seal. Yellow, blue, red, yellow, follow-up required. Relief nearly made me light-headed. I bowed my head in gratitude that was not entirely feigned. Survival in the Imperium often feels like a sin you didn't quite commit. They moved on. The audit continued down the rows, through the offices, into the hab corridors. They questioned workers on their way to latrines, mothers waiting for water rations, children returning from indoctrination classes, clutching their primer books, always gentle, always calm, always watching for cracks. By the end of the shift, the hab block looked like a shrine defaced by color-coded blasphemy. Yellow seals, blue seals. A few red ones, applied without ceremony to doors whose occupants were asked, politely, to gather their belongings. One of them was Mara. I saw her standing in the corridor, with a small bundle of clothes clutched to her chest, her hands shaking so badly the fabric rustled like dry leaves. An inspector knelt in front of her, speaking softly. "You are not in trouble," they said. "You are simply unresolved." "I remember," Mara whispered. "I know I remember. Some of it won't come when I call it. That is why we are here," the inspector replied kindly. "To help you stop calling." They placed a red seal on her door. "Disposal pending." The slate chimed. Her eyes met mine as they led her away. There was no accusation in them, no anger, only a quiet, animal confusion, like something caught in a trap it does not understand. That night, the loudailers activated at an unsanctioned hour. The sound jolted me awake, heart hammering, breath shallow. "Attention, provisional citizens." The voice announced, smooth and authoritative. "By decree of the administrator, your status has been updated. Pending verification of origin, you are hereby designated provisional assets. Movement restrictions now apply. Compliance ensures efficiency." Provisional. Asset. I lay there staring at the ceiling, at the cracks that formed shapes I used to amuse myself by naming. Now I wondered if the shapes were still allowed to exist. I wondered if tomorrow I would remember how to describe them. Sleep, when it came, was thin and sharp, edged. I dreamed of standing in line while a faceless clerk flipped through a ledger the size of a cathedral door. Each page bore rows of names. Mine was there, until it wasn't. The clerk licked a finger, turned the page, and I was gone. In the following days, the audit tightened its grip. Yellow seals became blue. Blue became red. The inspectors returned with serene regularity, their questions subtly altered, refined to catch those who had begun to adapt. Describe the ocean of your birth world. Name a seasonal festival unique to your origin. Recall the shape of your planet's primary shrine spire. Questions designed to punish memory. To make honesty dangerous and fabrication worse, I learned to answer with approved vagueness. Oceans became bodies of water. Festivals became days of devotion. Shrines became structures of faith. Each non-answer felt like tearing out a small piece of myself and offering it up for inspection. I watched families fracture under the weight of paperwork. A mother cleared with yellow, a father marked blue, a child red because children are terrible liars. They were separated with apologies and forms signed in duplicate. Love did not appear on any of the slates. Love was not a recognized category. The sound that haunted me most was not the screams, there were surprisingly few of those, but the stamping. The dull, rhythmic thud of seals being applied somewhere beyond the walls, each impact a finality. Each impact a decision that could not be appealed. At work, the ledgers grew thinner. Entire sections were removed, pages excised with surgical neatness. Shelves that had once sagged under the weight of recorded lives now stood bare, the metal showing pale where data had been. I began to hear quills even when none were present. In my head, always in my head, the scratching continued, writing, crossing out, rewriting, erasing. I realized then that the audit was not about finding the truth. It was about exhausting resistance, about making existence itself so conditional that you would accept any version of yourself the Imperium permitted. One evening, as I returned to my quarters, I passed the door to Mara's old hab. The red seal had been removed. The door stood open. Inside, the room was empty, not cleared but nullified. No furniture, no marks on the walls. As if no one had ever lived there, I stood there longer than was wise, staring into the blankness, feeling something hollow out behind my ribs. If they could do that to a room, I wondered, how long before they did it to me? They built the shrine in a place that used to be nothing. That was the first cruelty of it, not that it replaced something sacred, but that it claimed an absence and gave it meaning. At the end of my corridor, there had once been a maintenance alcove, a shallow recess where cracked pipes were exposed and the walls wept rust when the pressure fluctuated. No one lingered there. It was a place you passed without noticing, which in the hive is the closest thing to peace. One cycle, it was simply different. The pipes were gone. The rust stains scrubbed away. In their place stood a narrow plinth of cheap stonecrete, freshly poured, still smelling faintly of chemicals. Purity seals cascaded down its sides like parchment icicles, each stamped with identical sigils, each bearing a serial number instead of a prayer. Above it hung a banner, stark white against the grime of the corridor, the lettering so precise it felt like a threat. ACCPTHE RevCN. The words were printed in perfect block script, black ink on white cloth, impossible to misread, impossible to misunderstand. Someone had taken care to align it exactly at eye level. Someone had measured. I stopped short when I saw it, so did everyone else. For a moment, a dangerous unrecorded moment, we all simply stared. Then the hab warden cleared his throat, a sound amplified by the corridor's acoustics, and that was enough. The spell broke. People lowered their eyes. People moved on. By evening, the shrine was complete. Candles appeared, their wax pale and unscented, burning with a clean, efficient flame. A devotional slate was bolted into the wall above the plinth, cycling through approved aphorisms. Correction is mercy. Memory must serve order. The emperor sees what is removed. Each phrase lingered, just long enough to be read before being replaced, like a thought you were not allowed to finish. Attendance became mandatory the following morning. We were herded down the corridor in neat lines, hab wardens counting heads, shock batons held loosely but visibly. The shrine area had been expanded with temporary railings, funneling us into position. The corridor felt tighter than ever, the walls pressing in, the air thick with recycled breath and hot wax. Kneel, the warden commanded. We knelt. I felt it immediately, the ache in my joints, the protest of muscles not designed for prolonged submission. The floor was cold and gritty beneath my knees, small stones pressing through thin fabric. Someone behind me whimpered quietly and was silenced with a sharp tap of a baton against the wall. A preacher emerged from somewhere I hadn't seen him standing before. He wore a hooded robe the color of old parchment, his face partially obscured by shadow. In his hands he carried a data scroll rather than a book, its surface glowing faintly as it fed him the day's words. Citizens, he intoned, voice resonant and practiced. Today we give thanks for clarity. We bowed our heads, because that is what comes next. There are those who believe loss is cruel. He continued. They cling to names and places as if such things have intrinsic value. But the Imperium teaches us a higher truth. Suffering is born from error, and error is born from excess. His gaze swept over us. I could feel it like pressure, like fingers probing for weakness. When a world is removed from the record, he said, it is not punishment, it is mercy. A surgical act performed on the body of humanity, excising pain before it can spread. A murmur rippled through the kneeling crowd, not dissent, not agreement, but something like relief. The idea that our loss had meaning, that it was intentional, was easier to bear than the thought that it was arbitrary. The emperor, in his infinite wisdom, the preacher went on, does not burden us with unnecessary remembrance. He lightens our load, he corrects us. He raised one hand, and a servitor shuffled forward, its vox grill clicking softly. It held a censer that exhaled a thin stream of smoke, not incense, but something sharper, chemical, designed to heighten suggestibility. My eyes stung, my thoughts blurred at the edges. Repeat after me, the preacher said. We repeated. I am grateful for correction. The words tasted like chalk. I release what was never mine to keep. My tongue stumbled on never. I accept the revision. That one lodged in my chest like a stone. As the litany continued, I became aware of the sound beneath the preacher's voice, the faint clicking of counters. The hab wardens were recording compliance. Heads bowed, lips moving, knees on stone, each gesture logged, each hesitation noted. When the sermon ended, we were dismissed row by row. No one spoke. Speech felt dangerous here. Like sparks near leaking gas, I lingered after most had gone, rising slowly, joints screaming. Up close, the shrine was worse. The purity seals were not handwritten blessings but printed strips, mass-produced, their wax identical in shape and color. The devotional slate bore scratches already, as if something had tried, and failed, to claw its way out of the screen. I reached out before I could stop myself, fingers brushing the edge of the plinth. It was still warm from curing, still settling into place, new, unquestionable. "What troubles you?" a voice asked. I flinched. The preacher stood beside me now, close enough that I could smell him clean linen, antiseptic, the faint metallic tang of augmetics beneath flesh. His eyes were calm, assessing, bureaucratically kind. I swallowed. "I am struggling to reconcile the teaching with my memory." His expression did not change. "Memory is not a reliable tool," he said gently. "That is why we have records." I tried to confess, I said before I could stop myself. To the confessor servitor, but it only repeated approved litanies. A flicker, then something like amusement. "Of course it did." The preacher replied, "Confession is not for expressing doubt. It is for surrendering it." He gestured to the shrine. "That is what this is for." I wanted to ask him if he remembered. If he had grown up somewhere that now did not exist. If he ever woke with a word on his lips that he was not allowed to say. But the questions felt childish even as they formed, dangerous, inefficient. I bowed my head instead. "Thank you for the correction," I said, because that was what a grateful citizen would say. That night, I dreamed of corridors that narrowed the longer I walked them, walls inching closer with every step. At the end of each corridor stood the shrine, identical in every detail, banners whispering the same command. No matter which way I turned, there it was, waiting. In the days that followed, the shrine became a fixed point in our lives. People paused before it instinctively. Some whispered prayers that were not on the slate, their lips moving too quickly, too personally. Others avoided looking at it altogether, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the words might leap off the banner and brand them. I began to feel the corridor itself change. Sound dampened near the shrine, as if swallowed. The air felt thicker there, harder to breathe. My knees ached constantly, even when I had not knelt, as if my body were remembering submission before my mind caught up. Once I saw a child touch the banner, tracing the letters with a fingertip. A CCPH, Revision. His mother slapped his hand away sharply, eyes wide with terror. "Don't," she hissed. "It's not for us to touch." I understood then that the shrine was not meant to comfort us. It was meant to train us, to teach our bodies what our minds resisted, to make absence holy and obedience reflexive. When I passed it now, I felt smaller, less defined, like a draft copy waiting to be finalized. And somewhere, deep beneath the ache in my knees and the pressure in my chest, I felt the corridor narrowing still. The order came folded, not sealed. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Official correspondence is sealed. Judgment is sealed. Condemnation is sealed. But reassignment, reallocation, arrives already open, as if it has nothing to hide. As if resistance has already been calculated and found inefficient. The paper was thin and grey, stamped at the top with a designation I had only heard whispered before, Nemilesis Tichi Tempo a Leo or Hie Gemient. Beneath it, in smaller text, a phrase repeated 3 times for emphasis, applies to unverified populations until archival purity is restored. There was no appeal process listed. There never is. We were instructed to assemble at dawn in the lower transit square, bringing only sanctioned personal items. Identification tags were to be worn visibly at all times. Names were optional. Output was mandatory. The square was already crowded when I arrived. Rain fell steadily through the open superstructure above, cold and acidic, streaking grime down the walls and pooling around our boots. The hive never truly shelters you. It only delays exposure. Under the flickering lumen towers, we stood in clusters that pretended to be families, pretending harder not to be afraid. Hab wardens paced the perimeter, their greatcoats gleaming with fresh waterproofing. They carried clipboards and shock batons, the tools of order and pain kept conveniently close. Behind them waited the transports, flatbed carriers with mesh sides, their engines idling with a low, hungry rumble. No one asked where we were going. That was the most telling part. Even before the erasure, people always asked, Destination was a comfort. Purpose was a balm. Now, silence reigned. We had learned the lesson of the shrine too well. When the marching order was given, we moved as one body, slow and compliant. The rain-plastered hair to foreheads, soaked into thin coats, made everything heavier. I could taste the chemicals in it, metallic and bitter, mingling with the ever-present stink of oil and waste. The manufactorum gate loomed ahead, a cathedral of industry, its massive doors stained black by centuries of exhaust. Soot drifted down like corrupted snow, settling on shoulders, on lashes, on the open mouths of those too tired to close them. Above the gate, a sigil had been welded directly into the metal OUTPUTISEXISTNCE inside. The noise hit like a physical blow. Machines screamed in endless cycles, presses slamming, conveyors rattling, pistons hissing like enraged serpents. The air vibrated constantly, setting teeth on edge and thoughts askew. It smelled of hot metal, burned lubricant, and something faintly sweet that I realized too late was cooked flesh. We were processed quickly. Efficiency is mercy, according to the manuals. Identification tags were scanned, reassigned, rescored. Where my name had once been etched, there was now only a string of numbers and a labor code. The clerk who handed it back to me did not look up. Quota posted hourly, he said. Failure to meet quota will be addressed. How? Someone asked behind me, voice cracking. The clerk finally looked up then, his eyes flat, administratively. That was the last question anyone asked. I was assigned to line 17, substation C, tasked with sorting and feeding raw components into a cutter assembly that moved too fast and too close for comfort. There was no training beyond a pictogram bolted to the wall, arrows, hands, Rex marking where fingers should not go. The implication was clear: learn quickly or become material. Hours blurred together under the relentless rhythm of the machines. Feed, step back, feed, step back. The cutter screamed its approval or disapproval with each cycle. A lumen flashed green when quota was met, amber when it lagged, red when punishment was imminent. We did not speak. Speech cost breath, and breath was better spent surviving. Supervisors walked the lines with augmetic eyes that whirred softly as they scanned our output. They did not shout. Shouting wastes time. When someone slowed, when hands trembled too much, a supervisor would simply tap a rune on their slate. Sometimes a shock baton was used. Sometimes the worker was removed entirely, replaced by someone from the back of the line. No explanation, no interruption. I learned the new currency of survival quickly: silence, endurance. The ability to look grateful while being consumed. Looking grateful was the hardest part. Gratitude requires belief, and belief had become dangerous. But the cameras watched constantly, their red lenses blinking in patient rhythm. Faces that showed despair were flagged. Faces that showed anger were flagged faster, so I learned to soften my expression, to nod when the supervisor passed, to murmur thanks when given water that tasted of rust, to bow my head at the end of shift before the shrine bolted to the manufactorum wall, a smaller version of the one in my corridor, bearing the same command. A CCPT revision. At the end of the first shift, they lined us up by the time clock. The floor there was cleaner than anywhere else, scrubbed daily, the metal worn smooth. Along one wall lay a row of bodies neatly arranged, hands folded, identification tags affixed to their chests. The tags were pristine, white, unmarked by soot or blood. A clerk moved down the line with a stamp, pressing it onto a ledger resting on a portable stand. Administrative losses, he murmured with each impact. Thud, thud, thud. I recognized one of them, a man who had stumbled near the cutter in the third hour. His arm had gone in up to the elbow before anyone could stop the machine. He hadn't screamed for long. The body was clean now, washed, corrected. I stared too long. A supervisor noticed. Ease forward, he said calmly. Do not assign narrative where none is required. That night, in the barracks assigned to Namlis tie the laborers, I lay on a narrow cot among dozens of others, the air thick with sweat and machine grease. Somewhere nearby, someone sobbed quietly into their hands. Trying not to be heard, I flexed my fingers, checking them one by one, relieved each time they responded. I tried to remember what I had once used these hands for: writing, pointing out errors, filling forms. The memory felt distant, unreal, like someone else's life I had read about in a ledger now burned. I understood then what erasure truly was. Not a single moment, not a declaration, but a chain of small, sanctioned acts, each justified, each documented, each stamped and filed. A process with many receipts, and every receipt proved that this suffering was necessary. That realization settled over me like soot, heavy and impossible to brush away. I spoke the name by accident. That is the lie I tell myself, because accidents are forgivable in a system built on inevitability. The truth is more complicated. The truth is that exhaustion strips away caution faster than courage ever could. After 14 shifts under the nameless teeth, my body had become a ledger of pain, hands split and scabbed, joints inflamed, thoughts reduced to a dull, pulsing ache. I had learned to keep my mouth shut, to swallow memories like contraband, but memory ferments when sealed too long. It happened near the end of a shift, when the cutter jammed and the alarm wailed, a shrill, punishing sound that rattled the bones. A supervisor shouted instructions, overlapping with another voice, and in the confusion someone asked, "Where did you learn to clear a jam like that?" I answered without thinking. I learned back home, on. The syllables escaped me like blood from a bitten tongue. The name was not loud. It was not shouted in defiance. It was breathed half-formed, a reflex older than fear. But the manufacturum is designed to hear everything that matters. Microphones are embedded in the walls, the floors, the machines themselves. The alarm stopped. The cutter resumed. The supervisor did not react. That was worse. 2 shifts later, they came for me. It was after lights out in the barracks, when the air was thick with the sound of shallow sleep and muted suffering. A lumen snapped on without warning, harsh and white. A hab warden stood at the foot of my cot, flanked by 2 figures in archivist grey, asset designation. One of them asked. I gave the number. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Compliance noted. The other replied, "You are required for clarification. No chains, no violence. Just the certainty that resistance would be a waste of time." They marched me through corridors I had never seen before, descending levels marked only by fading numerals and prayer sigils worn smooth by countless hands. The air grew cooler, damper. The smell changed from oil and sweat to wet stone, old parchment, and something faintly medicinal. The archive, spire loomed beneath the manufactorum, like a buried organ, its foundations older than the hive itself. We entered through a service door barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, and the sound of the city above faded into a distant, forgotten hum. The cipher cells were below that. They were not cells in the way prisons are cells. There were no bars, no shackles. Just small chambers of stone and plasteel, each lit by a single lumen recessed so deeply into the ceiling that it cast no shadows you could trust. The walls were lined with shelves, not empty, but filled with scrolls, data slates, and sealed boxes labeled with codes rather than names. I was seated at a metal table bolted to the floor. The surface was scarred with old scratches, some deep enough to catch a fingernail. Someone had tried to count time here once, I thought, carving marks until the habit was corrected. The interrogators entered without ceremony, 2 of them. No insignia beyond their coats, no visible weapons. Their calm was absolute. "We are here to assist you," the first said, taking a seat opposite me. "There has been a discrepancy." The second remained standing, hands folded behind their back, eyes never leaving my face. "Do you understand why you are here?" the first asked. "Yes," I said. "Explain." I hesitated. "Just a fraction." The second interrogator tapped something on their slate. "Instability noted." The slate chimed softly. "We understand that fatigue impairs accuracy," the first said kindly. "So we will proceed slowly. Please describe your place of origin." The room felt smaller. The shelves seemed closer. I swallowed. "It was a world," I said carefully. "A sanctioned world, productive, faithful. Describe its oceans." The interrogator prompted. I closed my eyes before I could stop myself. I saw water stretching to the horizon, saw the way light fractured on its surface, heard waves against stone. They were, I began. A sharp crack interrupted me. Pain flared behind my eyes, white and blinding. I gasped, hands spasming against the table. "Correction," the second interrogator said calmly. The first nodded. "Please continue," with approved terminology. I tried again, keeping my eyes open this time, fixing my gaze on the slate in front of me. "There were bodies of water," I said, "large, useful for transport, acceptable." The slate murmured. Describe the skyline of your primary habitation. The interrogator continued. I answered. Vaguely. Each time I strayed too close to specificity, there was a correction, a shock, a sedative injected into my neck, a forced prayer recited aloud while my jaw was guided by cold fingers. They were not trying to prove I was lying. They were trying to make me doubt myself. Between questions, they inserted new pages into a thin folder on the table. I caught glimpses of it when my vision cleared my designation number at the top, followed by statements attributed to me that I did not remember making. Subject exhibits confusion regarding spatial descriptors. Subject demonstrates emotional attachment to unverifiable constructs. Subject benefits from corrective reinforcement. Sign here. The first interrogator said at one point, sliding the folder toward me. I stared at the signature line. My hand shook as I took the pen. The act of signing felt heavier than any shock. With each page added, something was taken away. Hours or days. Time behaved strangely here. Passed like this. The questions grew more abstract. Describe the season in which you felt most content. Name a sound associated with home. What color was the sky? Each answer narrowed the room. Each correction widened the gap between what I remembered and what I was permitted to remember. Eventually, even the safe answers began to feel dangerous. At some point, I realized I was no longer sure whether the images in my mind were memories or inventions. Had the ocean really been that blue? Had the skyline truly leaned west at dusk? Or were those details borrowed from sanctioned picts, from sermons, from stories I had absorbed secondhand? The interrogators watched this realization dawn with quiet satisfaction. You see, the first said gently, memory is unreliable. Records endure. They left me alone for a while after that. The lumen dimmed slightly, never enough to allow rest. I sat there, breathing shallowly, listening to the distant rustle of parchment and the soft hum of cogitators processing lives into order. I tried to hold on to one thing, one true detail that could not be corrected away. But each time I grasped at something, it slipped through my thoughts like smoke. When they returned, the first interrogator placed the folder before me again. Final clarification, they said. Do you accept that your memories are subject to revision? I looked at the pages, at the neat handwriting, at the authority stamped into every margin. Yes, I said. The word felt like surrender. It felt like relief. Good, the interrogator replied. When memory becomes a crime, innocence is impossible. Acceptance is the only remaining virtue. They stood. The second interrogator pressed a seal onto the folder, blue, edged with red, disposition pending. The slate chimed. As they led me out of the cipher cell, my legs unsteady, I realized something with a clarity sharper than pain. They had not erased my world in that room. They had erased my certainty that it had ever been real. They did not keep me long after the cipher cells. That is another kindness the Imperium grants sparingly. Once a conclusion is reached, delay is inefficient. I was returned to the surface levels beneath the archive spire, placed in a holding corridor where the walls were lined with filing cabinets instead of cells. There were thousands of them, stretching away in perfect ranks, their drawers humming softly as internal cogitators maintained order. The sound reminded me of insects nesting behind walls, alive, tireless, indifferent. I waited there for what felt like an entire sleep cycle, though no lumen ever dimmed enough to confirm it. My thoughts drifted in circles, snagging on fragments that no longer trusted themselves. I tried to pray, but the words came out mismatched, assembled from approved phrases without conviction. Faith, I was learning, is difficult when every belief feels provisional. When they came for me again, it was with ceremony. 2 archivists in grey coats escorted me forward, boots finally echoing on the polished floor. Ahead, a wide door stood open, its surface engraved with sigils of authority layered atop one another like scar tissue. Beyond it lay a chamber so vast it stole my breath. The hall of records. Filing cabinets rose on either side like cathedral pillars, each one taller than any block I had lived in. Drawers extended upward into shadow, each labeled with alphanumeric designations, too small to read from where I stood. The air vibrated with the collective weight of recorded lives, births, assignments, corrections, deletions, all humming together in a bureaucratic choir. I was marched down the central aisle, my footsteps obscenely loud in the quiet. With each step, I felt smaller, more theoretical, as if I were already being reduced to annotation. At the far end of the hall stood a single desk, massive and immovable, carved from dark plasteel polished to a mirror sheen. Behind it sat a functionary in black robes trimmed with red thread, the color of final authority. Their face was human, but their eyes were augmetic lenses that adjusted focus with soft mechanical clicks. A set designation. They asked. I gave the number. They nodded once and activated a slate embedded in the desk. A holographic projection bloomed above it, a web of text, images, and symbols rotating slowly in the air. I recognized pieces of myself in it, work records, audit notes, interrogation summaries, each fragment stripped of context and arranged for judgment. Be authority vested in this office. The functionary intoned, voice amplified but emotionless. A determination has been reached regarding the null entry associated with your provisional existence. I did not respond. I did not trust myself to. Full redaction authorization is hereby issued, they continued. This applies to all persons, assets, cultural residue, and derivative memories associated with said null entry. The words landed with crushing finality. Full redaction, not suspension, not reassignment, an ending that would not be revised. You have been selected for resolution. The functionary said, as if this were an honor. 2 outcomes are available. They gestured, and the projection split into 2 columns. Option 1, they said, sanctioned oblivion. You will be rendered into a servitor state, your remaining biological utility preserved for Imperial function. Your memories will be excised. Your doubts will cease. You will continue to serve. The image shifted. A schematic of a human form stripped of identity, limbs reinforced with augmetics, a blank faceplate where expression once lived. Option 2, the functionary continued, as unsanctioned oblivion, immediate disposal. Your biological matter will be reclaimed. Your records will be closed. The second image was simpler. A red stamp. To Amity, I stared at the projections, feeling my heart beat slow, deliberate, as if even it were waiting for instruction. This was the choice they always offer at the end, not life or death, but utility or waste. Which do you select? The functionary asked. I thought of Mara's empty room, of the man on the manufactorum floor, washed clean and tagged, of the cipher cell, where doubt had been cultivated like a crop. Hope, I realized, was a luxury reserved for those with recognized birthplaces. I choose to serve, I said. The words tasted of dust. Compliance acknowledged. The functionary replied. A drawer slid open in the desk with a heavy thunk, revealing a single sheet of parchment and a pen attached by a short chain. The pen's nib glinted sharply under the lumen glow. Sign, they said. I took the pen. It was heavier than expected, its grip worn smooth by countless hands that had made the same decision. The parchment bore a dense block of text, legal language so compressed it felt designed to suffocate dissent. I did not read it. Reading would have been a performance. My hand trembled as I signed, not my name, but my designation. The act felt like cutting the last thread that connected me to myself. As the pen left the page, I felt something inside me go quiet, like a candle snuffed under glass. The functionary pressed a stamp down onto the parchment. Thud. The sound echoed unnaturally in the vast hall, bouncing between the filing cabinets like a verdict shouted into eternity. Processing will commence shortly, they said. You may experience disorientation. This is normal. Resistance is inefficient. The archivists took my arms, not roughly but firmly, and guided me away from the desk. As we walked back down the aisle, I felt the weight of the cabinets press in on me from both sides. I imagined drawers sliding open, my remaining fragments being sorted, corrected, filed. At the threshold of the hall, I glanced back once. The functionary was already reviewing another projection, another life reduced to options. I was no longer of interest. In the eyes of the Imperium, I had never existed, only my utility had. They led me into a preparation chamber where the walls were tiled in white ceramite, scrubbed so clean they reflected my distorted image. I barely recognized the person staring back at me, gaunt, eyes hollow, posture already bent toward obedience. A servitor approached, its movements smooth and precise. It began attaching restraint cuffs, murmuring binharic prayers under its breath. I did not resist. Resistance would have been a statement, and statements require an audience. As they guided me toward the processing queue beyond, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace, never peace, but acceptance. The conditioned reflex the shrine had tried to teach us. The papers were stamped. The order was complete. Whatever remained of me was now scheduled, catalogued, and useful. I speak now from a place without walls. That is the first thing they take from you, not thought, not memory, but location. I am suspended in a queue that is neither corridor nor chamber, a threshold where bodies are stored like paperwork waiting for a final stamp. Above me, a single lumen flickers with mechanical fatigue, its light pulsing weakly, as if even illumination must ration itself here. Each flicker feels like a failing heartbeat, and I find myself counting them, because counting is one of the last habits they have not corrected out of me. I am no longer addressed by name. I am not even addressed by designation. The monitors list me as a function awaiting activation, a resource pending conversion. My identity has been reduced to a line of text so short it barely seems worth printing. A serial number, a task category, a checkbox. I can still feel my body, though it no longer feels like mine. It lies heavy and unresponsive beneath layers of restraint, muscles dulled by sedatives calibrated to suppress panic without inducing sleep. Panic, after all, is still movement, still resistance, still waste. Around me, others wait in silence. I cannot see their faces, but I can hear them, soft breaths, the faint whine of restraint mechanisms adjusting, the occasional wet cough from someone whose lungs are failing faster than the schedule anticipated. No one speaks. Speech has no function here. Words are for those who can still be corrected. The smell is what lingers most. Sterilizing chemicals layered over old blood. Hot metal, singed hair, and beneath it all, the faint, unmistakable scent of incense, because even here, even now, faith must be present to sanctify the machinery. The Imperium does nothing without blessing its violence. I think of the shrine at the end of my corridor. I think of the banner. ACCPTHE Revision. How small it seemed then. How contained. How foolish I was to think the revision would stop at memory, at maps, at words. Revision is not content with paper. It wants flesh. It wants nerve and bone and will. It wants anything that can remember a version of reality that was not approved. I try to recall my world one last time, not its name. I have learned better than that, but its feeling. The gravity of it. The way my feet once pressed into ground that belonged somewhere. I search for the memory the way a tongue probes a missing tooth, circling an absence that aches despite itself. There is a flicker, a hint of color, a suggestion of sound. Then it falters, not because they have taken it, at least, not entirely, but because doubt has eaten away its edges. I can no longer tell where memory ends and invention begins. Was the sky truly that color? Did the wind really smell like that? Or am I assembling a world from fragments borrowed from sanctioned picked feeds and approved hymns? This, I realize, is the Imperium's final mercy. It does not merely erase you. It ensures you are never fully certain you deserve to exist in the first place. A servitor passes along the line, its metal feet clicking softly against the floor. It pauses beside me. An augmetic arm descends, attaching leads to my temples with gentle precision. The touch is almost tender. The machine does not hate me. It does not know what hate is. Remain calm. It intones, voice filtered and sexless. Processing ensures continued service. I want to tell it that service is all I have ever done. That I served with quill and ledger, with silence and obedience, with blood and doubt. That I bent every time the Imperium leaned on me, until bending became my natural state. But the words stay inside, beyond the walls. If walls still exist, life continues. I know this because I can hear it, faintly, like a city heard through deep water. Shift bells tolling, load hailers announcing quotas. Sermons recited with practiced devotion. Somewhere a clerk stamps a form without ever knowing what it authorizes. Somewhere, a child asks a question and is taught not to ask it again. The galaxy does not pause for erasure. It absorbs it. I understand now that the Imperium does not kill you only with bolts and blades. Those are crude tools, reserved for enemies who announce themselves. The Imperium kills with patience, with forms filed in triplicate, with revisions that feel reasonable until they have hollowed you out completely, with the calm certainty that a stamp is more real than flesh, The lumen above me flickers again. A final procedure begins. I feel pressure at the base of my skull, a vibration that resonates through bone and thought alike. Images stutter across my mind, not memories anymore, but echoes of them. Faces without names, places without coordinates, a banner, a gap in the stars. I want to scream my world's name one last time, but there is no room for it. The sound dies before it reaches my lips, swallowed by protocols, by conditioning, by the quiet, absolute authority of the archive. Somewhere, a drawer slides shut. Somewhere, a record updates from pending to resolved. Soon, the last private syllable of my erased world will die inside me, unspoken and unrecorded, and the galaxy will remain unchanged. That is the most faithful horror of all.